Hi, Peter Charles here, folks, fly fishing. And today we're going to tie one of my mistakes. And it's been a very, very effective fish catcher for me. But it was an accident, and I don't mind admitting that. About 25 years ago, I was going through a bit of a doldrum with my fish catching. And I stopped by the local fishing shop and I said, okay, what kind of flies are you catching fish on? This guy was a guide, so I figured he'd know. And he hauled out a little wet fly which he called the Professor. And it's a famous old wet fly. And he said he was catching a ton of fish on it. So I bought a Professor and I bought a bunch of material to go home and tie up a bunch. Well, somewhere along the way I misplaced the fly. So I tied it from memory instead. So instead of tying a wet fly, I ended up tying a little streamer. More than that, I forgot the throat. So I actually tied a somewhat different pattern. And it was to be fished differently as well. Well, I ended up finding the fly and going, oh, did I ever screw up? So I had, I don't know, a dozen, 2 dozen of these flies tied, so I wasn't going to throw them away. But they probably sat in the fly box for a good year before I got up the gumption to try one. And I was at a spot called Cedar Run on the Grand River in Fergus. And it was a Saturday, so it was busy. It was prime season. And you know, there wasn't any room to fish. I mean, there was guys lined up from one end to the other. So I ended up sort of slotting myself in a gap in some very unproductive looking water. And I thought, oh well, you know, I'll go in here, and since there's nothing happening, I'm going to put on a sink tip and I'll swing a streamer. And I decided for whatever reason to tie on one of these little flies. Well, it was like a fish fest. Nobody else was catching anything except me, and I became instantly very unpopular. It was just one after another after another. The little trout wouldn't leave this thing alone. I've since found that it'll take panfish quite well, and I've come up with 2 other variants. I've come up with, the first one I should say, I called it a mini brown, I should say. I should give you the name first, right? I've also come up with the Mini-Brookie and the mini bow. These have been effective too. The mini bow especially for perch. You wouldn't think that, but you chuck that out there on a sinking line for perch and you'll nail one after another after another. They can't leave the thing alone. I'd have a fish would hit, hook up, get off. I'd strip it a couple of inches and there'd be another one on. I mean, it was just one after another. So they're very effective little patterns. And I mean, I've done extremely well with them over the years. So here we go. We're going to tie the mini brown today, but there's also the Mini-Brookie and the mini bow as well, if you want to go those routes as well. Okay, let's get started and take a look at the hook. Now, I'm using a Daiichi 1740 size 8, and the important thing about this hook is it's got an up eye. Now, I used to tie all this on a regular streamer hook with a down eye. What's the difference, you say? Well, as I've learned over the years, if you have an up eye hook and you strip it through relatively slow flows, it stays pretty level. But if you strip a down eye hook through slow flows, it sags butt down and it doesn't come through level. So you don't get a very natural looking presentation. So I've gone to using an up eye hook on this pattern and it works extremely well. You could use a size 8, size 10, maybe even a size 6 if you wanted to, but I wouldn't go any bigger than that. My thread is a 6/0 yellow. The tail is red schlappen. You could use red saddle hackle as well if you wished. I've got a wire rib, which is gold in a small size. The body is yellow floss. And my wing is natural mallard flank. For this pattern, you could use either the natural mallard or you could use a tan-dyed mallard as well, or a wood duck. They both all work. So let's get started. I'm going to tie my thread right on behind the eye, and you'll see why in a sec. Now I'm going to start with the schlappen, and I'm going to take off maybe about 1/4 inch. Bunch them together, and I will just pinch loop these in and put a couple of wraps to hold, just like that. This is kind of a speed way of tying this, but also produces a very nice body. Now I'm going to tie in the wire, And what I'm going to do is tie it right where I left off tying in the tail. Now I'm going to tie in the yellow floss. I'm just going to continue on from where that was left off. Now I'm going to pull the whole thing up and wind back. I'm going to make sure I'm going to get nice touching turns here, all the way back. Go right back just before the bend starts. Now I'll come forward again, touching turns. There's a reason why I tied on that nice flat body. One is that when we're tying floss, we want a flat body so we get a nice look when we put the floss on. But there's a bigger reason for this in this particular fly. When you're using a light colored floss, if you use a different color thread underneath or different material showing up through underneath, that floss becomes translucent when wet and that underbody color shines through. That can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on what you're after, but you should be aware of it. So I'm making sure I cover that red with the yellow so when this fly is fished and it gets wet, it stays yellow. Now, you see I just missed there. I want to stay in touching turns. And if you get a little bit too far apart, just back up, start again. Now this is something I do when I'm finishing off this, when I'm doing streamers with a wing. I will put a wrap on top to trap that material in, because any tag that's showing here at the top is going to be hidden by the wing, so we don't care. Now we're going to do the rib, and we're going to counterwind the rib. And you have to be careful, sometimes you knock your tail askew, so just make sure you haven't done that. And if you're finding your tail is starting to move, just give it a pull. There we go. I'm going to do the same thing with the wire. Bring it on top, lock it in place. Then I'll just come in with my fingernail clippers and take it off. Now I'm going to use my mallard, and I'm just going to pull off a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch, or about 8 millimeters roughly. Now, something to make mention of. If you use the barbs from lower down on the quill, they tend to be webby, so the wing will stick together. If you use them further up on the quill, they tend to separate more. It depends on the look you want. I like to use the upper barbs because I feel that they flutter better in current. And that's one of the things we're after with this fly. And you can see how it's spreading, and I don't mind that. Bring the thread back, put a couple of wraps, check its position. It's a little long, it's going to pull it. Okay, that's good. Now you can see that splaying, and that is not a nice looking fly. Somebody's going to say, ooh, that's ugly, it's all splayed. It's not about the looks, it's about how it's going to fish. Now what we're going to do is we're going to clean this up. Now you're looking at that yellow thread and you're saying to yourself, well, that's ugly, shouldn't it be black? Well, I could have used a magic marker and colored my yellow. That would work. But I'm going to use, I've always used blackhead cement for this fly, so I'm going to do that today. I just use my bodkin and apply the head cement. There, I'll wait for that to dry, and then I'll put a gloss finish on it afterwards, maybe some UV finish, for example, to bulk it up a little bit, and we're ready to go fishing. Now, the interesting thing about this kind of fly is I actually like a big head on this fly, and the reason for this is I want it to push water. I want it to create turbulence. When we do flies, you know, when we try to tie something really nice, we might tie a small head, and I could tie a small head on this fly. But I want that big black head, and I want a nice big black shiny head, because it's going to reflect light and it's going to push water. And both these things have worked for this fly. Whenever I've tied it in this fashion with a large head and a bright shiny finish, it's been a fish catcher. So why change? So if you want to make some modifications to this pattern, one of the things you could do is use a wood duck or a tan mallard for the wing. Other than that, I'd suggest leave it like it is. It works. Just fish it on an intermediate line or a sink tip line, or put some polylators on the end of your floater. Get it down a little bit and the fish whack it. So there you go. The mini brown, and don't forget the mini bow and the mini brookie as well. They all work. Cheers.